June 22, 1941, Eastern Front just outside Brest-Litovsk. Dawn bled across the horizon as hundreds of German tanks growled eastward, their treads biting into the soft Polish soil. Engines roared in unison, a mechanical symphony that echoed the confidence of the Wehrmacht. Inside a Panzer III, Lieutenant Karl Reinhardt leaned against the turret rim, cigarette between his lips, and smirked. "Look at them," he muttered, watching through his binoculars as Soviet T-26s and BT-7s burned on the horizon. "Tin toys, this war will be over by Christmas." His crew laughed. They had every reason to. By midsummer, the Blitzkrieg had torn through Western Europe, crushing France in weeks. Against that legacy of lightning victories, the Red Army's early defenses looked pitiful: obsolete machines, chaotic retreats, and soldiers running without boots. As the Panzer spearheads advanced deeper into the Soviet Union, confidence swelled. Roads were littered with destroyed enemy armor, thinly armored, poorly maintained, and no match for German precision. Reports of Soviet tank battalions being routed in minutes flooded headquarters. Commanders joked that the Russians built their tanks from scrap metal. But beneath that haze of triumph, something strange was happening. In late July, near Minsk, a reconnaissance unit radioed an unusual sighting. They'd encountered a new kind of Soviet tank, bigger, lower, and faster than anything in the Red Army's inventory. The shells from 37 mm German guns bounced off it like pebbles on stone. At first, no one believed it. Propaganda, they said, an isolated incident, maybe the crew had panicked. Then came Smolensk. It was here, amid the summer heat and the roar of artillery, that the laughter stopped. On July 17th, a column of German armor rolled through the outskirts of the city, expecting another easy victory. Reinhardt's Panzer III led the charge. The wheat fields shimmered gold around them, the air smelled of oil and dust. Suddenly, a thunderclap. A shell tore through the lead vehicle, its turret blown skyward. Reinhardt jerked his head up, scanning for the source. Through the shimmering haze, he saw it silhouetted against the treeline, a tank with broad tracks, angled armor glinting in the sun, and a long, lethal barrel trained directly at them. "Was das?" his gunner shouted. Before Reinhardt could answer, another shell screamed in, slamming into the side of a Panzer IV. Flames erupted. The German formation broke into chaos. Their shells pinged harmlessly off the enemy's armor. The Soviet machine, painted in rough green, tracks clawing through the mud, kept advancing. The crew's laughter was gone now, replaced by disbelief. Reinhardt slammed his periscope forward, catching a clear glimpse of the beast, a turret with smooth slopes, a low profile, and armor that seemed to swallow fire. Its gun muzzle flashed again, and another German tank disintegrated. He finally muttered the words no German wanted to say. "It's invincible." The T-34 had arrived. And with it, the myth of German invincibility began to crack. Section 2, The Invincible Machine. August 1941, near Yelnya, east of Smolensk. The smell of burning oil hung heavy over the steppe. The once golden fields were black now, charred by the wrecks of German armor. Lieutenant Reinhardt crouched behind his panzer, binoculars pressed to his face as he tracked the movement of the Soviet tanks that had ambushed them at dawn. Through the drifting smoke, he saw them again, those same green monsters rumbling over the ridgeline. They moved differently. Their tracks were wide, gripping the soft earth where German vehicles bogged down. Their armor plates were angled, deflecting incoming fire. And when they fired, their 76 guns thundered with terrifying precision. Reinhardt's gunner hands spat on the dirt. "They shouldn't even exist, sir. Intel said their factories were rubble." Reinhardt said nothing. He'd seen too many contradictions in this campaign already, columns of prisoners one day and Soviet counterattacks the next. But this tank was something else entirely. It wasn't just another enemy machine, it was a declaration. Across the front, reports were flooding in. German shells shattering against invisible walls, engines failing in the mud while Soviet armor rolled through like phantoms. At Army headquarters, staff officers pored over reconnaissance photos, whispering in disbelief. "Sloped armor," one said, tracing the image with a pencil. "It's not just thick, it redirects the impact." Another pointed out the diesel engine, the wide tracks, the simplicity of the design. It was revolutionary, everything the Panzer divisions were not. By September, German tank crews began giving it a name spoken with equal parts fear and respect: T-34. The first captured examples were rushed back to testing grounds in Kummersdorf. Engineers circled the machine like archaeologists uncovering a lost civilization. Its 45-degree sloped armor, ingenious in its simplicity, meant that even when hit, shells often glanced off harmlessly. The tracks were broad enough to glide through mud and snow, giving it an advantage no German vehicle could match, and its 76mm gun could destroy a Panzer III from over a kilometer away. One Wehrmacht engineer summed it up bluntly. If we had this tank in France, the war would have ended by August. But while the generals admired the T-34, the soldiers in the field feared it. Near Bryansk, a platoon of German tanks tried to flank a Soviet column at dawn. They fired first 5, 6, 7 shots. Sparks flew as the shells struck uselessly against armor. The T-34s turned their turrets in eerie unison like predators noticing prey. The German radios filled with panic. Cannot penetrate, cannot penetrate. Then the Soviet guns answered. One by one, the German tanks were reduced to fireballs. Survivors fled on foot, leaving behind charred steel skeletons that marked the end of the Wehrmacht's arrogance. Reinhardt's own company limped back that night. Mud-caked, eyes hollow, no one laughed anymore. Around the campfire, they spoke in low voices about ghosts made of steel, about engines that never overheated, about a new kind of war they didn't yet understand. And yet, deep in the heart of Germany, in secret workshops and design bureaus, others were already taking notes. The shock would soon become an obsession. For the first time, the hunters of Europe were being hunted. Section 3. The German Obsession. October 1941, Kummersdorf Testing Grounds, Germany. The captured T-34 sat in the cold morning mist like an animal in a cage. German engineers surrounded it, clipboards in hand, flashlights sweeping over its dented armor. It was riddled with battle scars but still intimidating, its presence almost defiant even in defeat. Major Heinrich Niepkamp, one of Germany's leading tank designers, tapped the armor with his gloved knuckles and muttered, "It's crude but brilliant." He wasn't wrong. The Soviets had built a tank that looked rough, weld seams uneven, paint chipped, but every inch of it was purposeful. Simple to build, easy to repair, and devastatingly effective. One of the younger engineers leaned close to the glacis plate. "Sir, look at this slope, our 15 rounds can't even grip it." Niepkamp nodded grimly. "They built this for their terrain, mud, snow, no roads. The Russians fight with the land, we fight against it." That line would echo through every German design bureau for the next 2 years. Across occupied Europe, Germany's military-industrial complex shifted gears. Factories that had once focused on perfecting the elegant, over-engineered panzers now began studying the enemy's crude genius. The order was clear from Berlin: match it, beat it. In a secret conference, General Heinz Guderian presented the findings to Hitler himself. "My Führer," Guderian said, sliding a dossier across the table, "the Russian T-34 is superior to every tank we have." Hitler frowned, tapping his finger on the page. "Superior, how can this be?" Guderian answered carefully. "Sloped armor, high-velocity gun, mobility unmatched in any terrain. If we do not respond, our armored forces will become obsolete within a year." Silence. Then Hitler spoke the words that would birth 2 of Germany's most famous machines. "Then we will build something greater." From that moment, design work accelerated on what would become the Panther and eventually the Tiger tanks, both inspired directly or indirectly by the Soviet T-34. But while German engineers raced to reinvent the Panzer, the Eastern Front continued to bleed. By the time the first Panther prototypes rolled out in 1942, the Wehrmacht had already learned the hard way that quality could not always replace quantity. The Soviets were building 1,200 T-34s every month. German factories, despite their precision, couldn't match that pace. Back in the field, Lieutenant Reinhardt, now commanding a reduced platoon, watched columns of T-34s advance through the snow near Kaluga. His radio crackled with reports of entire regiments wiped out overnight. His breath fogged the inside of his goggles as he whispered, "They never stop coming." The laughter of June 1941 was now a distant echo. Every new Soviet offensive brought more of these unstoppable machines, swarming like ghosts across the steppe. Even when German tanks scored kills, the Soviets replaced their losses in weeks. To the men on the ground, the T-34 was no longer just a tank. It was a symbol, the mechanical embodiment of a nation that refused to die. And deep down, Reinhardt understood something he'd never dared admit aloud. This was no longer a war of skill or machinery, it was a war of endurance. And the Soviets had far more blood to give. Section 4, The Turning of the Steel Tide. January 1943, outside Stalingrad. The wind howled across the steppe like a living thing, carrying with it the smell of smoke, frozen flesh, and diesel. The once-proud Sixth Army was trapped, encircled in the ruins of a city that had become a graveyard of men and machines. Lieutenant Karl Reinhardt stood beside his immobilized Panzer III, frost on his eyelashes, watching as distant shapes emerged from the blizzard. They came in silence at first, dark hulking silhouettes moving in tight formation. Then came the familiar rumble, the deep, steady growl of V2 diesel engines. T-34s, Hans whispered, his voice thin against the wind. Reinhardt nodded slowly, they're everywhere. The Soviet counteroffensive had unleashed a tidal wave of armor. T-34s rolled across the frozen Volga, their treads crunching over the wreckage of German supply convoys. Even without air cover, they advanced relentlessly, shrugging off small arms fire and anti-tank shells that shattered uselessly against their angled hides. The Germans fired until their barrels overheated. Ammunition ran dry. Still, the T-34s came on. Their crews fought with a terrifying determination, young, often barely trained, but fearless. They rammed German positions when their guns jammed. They burned, but they did not retreat. One Soviet tank, its paint scorched black, charged headlong into Reinhardt's flank. The impact shook the ground, throwing him to his knees. Through the smoke and the roar, he glimpsed the driver inside, a boy no older than 18, eyes fixed forward as flames consumed his turret. Reinhardt froze. For the first time in the war, he wasn't looking at an enemy, he was looking at a force of nature. All across the Eastern Front, the story was the same. The once invincible Wehrmacht was being pushed backward, its armored spearheads shattered against an industrial avalanche. German crews began calling the T-34 Der Teufel auf Ketten, the devil on tracks. By mid-1943 at Kursk, that devil revealed its full fury. The largest tank battle in history unfolded across the Russian plains, thousands of machines colliding in a storm of fire and mud. Panthers and Tigers made their long-awaited debut, massive and deadly, yet even they were too few. The T-34s swarmed them like wolves. Their sheer numbers overwhelmed the German lines. For every Tiger that claimed 3 or 4 kills, 5 more T-34s would appear from the smoke, circling, flanking, outlasting. When the guns finally fell silent, it was clear the tide had turned. The T-34 had done more than stop the blitzkrieg, it had reversed it. Months later, in a prisoner column trudging westward after the fall of Kharkov, Reinhardt glanced back at the eastern horizon. In the fading light, he saw them again, those unmistakable silhouettes cresting a ridge, their turrets glinting like black mirrors in the snow. He remembered the laughter from that first summer in 1941. He remembered the arrogance, the disbelief. And now he understood the final truth of the Eastern Front. Germany's finest minds had underestimated a simple, rugged machine, and in doing so, they'd underestimated the people who built it. The T-34 wasn't just a tank, it was the will of an entire nation forged in steel. And that will had crushed their panzers,